Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction there. In fact, I've even started a new company, which we'll touch on a little bit in the end of this quick overview here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to punch this up another level. We're going to basically be talking about the cloud in a much broader context, I would say. The broader context of technology, bigger trends of technology, but also bigger trends that are happening in our society, in this country, and ultimately I think what's really happening through the world. Because the cloud is a piece of a much larger thing, but a very vital piece of what's happening. And I think to start that, I want to kind of get us back. A lot of you are kind of rooted in digital technology to get the kind of basics of the computer revolution, the digital revolution. But it's worth reminding ourselves of a couple of the key driving forces that have a lot more power to them, which are going to have a lot more movement ahead. And the one is, in fact, we've got this kind of classic Moore's Law situation where we have computer power doubling every 2 years, and in fact dropping the cost of computer power. Now, the reason this is really important is that even in the 30 years from that first Apple II there, where a megahertz costs about $5,000 in today's dollars, 30 years later, you got 2 gigahertz or 2,000 megahertz, and in fact, you've got computers that are 10,000 times more powerful or 10,000 times cheaper. Now, this dynamic has another about 10 years till we get to this so small that it's starting to actually get the atomic level, and we're going to start choking this off, but there's workarounds even there. But the idea is that these computers are getting insanely powerful. So if you went back to that same period of that Apple II, that first PC, you'd essentially get a supercomputer, which at those days, if you measure it by megaflops, you had about 150 megaflops for 31 million bucks. That's basically what's in the iPad 2 right now. In fact, it beats it. And that flipped that chip into the iPhone 4. And so we've essentially got $31 million supercomputers, which are going to keep doubling power for about the next 10 years. So think about the first, at the core level, these are getting to be insanely powerful tools. The second thing online we forget about is the context of how we're wiring this whole planet up. All these chips getting connected up together. So here, if you just go back 10 years, or the turn of the century, remind ourselves, only 31% of North America was online. It's crazy. We think, oh yeah, everyone was online, right? And look at the rest of the world, nothing basically. This is 10 years later. In fact, we've got about 80% of North America online, but look at the Middle East, is that the 30% that in fact the US was 10 years before. And what happens, of course, we got the whole conflictations happening with the revolutions there. But the point is, there's still a lot of running room left. So if you look ahead here, right now in the next 10 years, right now we've got about a third of the planet online. That's where we're at. Interestingly enough, we got about 75% of people on the planet have cell phones right now, which is astounding, thinking that most people in this auditorium maybe 15 years ago probably didn't have a cell phone. But what's clearly going to happen in the next 10 years, you can just bank on it, is we know that those phone connections, the kind of audio phone connections will continue through every spot on the planet, and everyone will get these except for a few destitute people. On the backs of that, we're going to run the internet, 3G level kind of internet on that. And on the backs of that, you know what's going to happen is the broadband 4G or equivalents are going to go on that. So within 10 years, you've essentially got the entire planet connected up in the way that we basically, in those early wired days, when we first were kind of preaching the digital revolution, was essentially the promised land. Now, these are the two. This is essentially the foundational platform of the cloud. That is still a process in getting built out, but one that's getting pretty damn robust. So when you really get down to what the fundamental advantages of the cloud, not the specific applications, which they were basically laying out beautifully before me here, is there's two really fundamental things that are going on here. Is that the cloud allows you essentially to connect your very powerful phone or computer to tens of thousands of these powerful computers. And so like the basic way to think of the cloud is Google. Google essentially is one of the first applications of really using the cloud very powerfully in the kind of really fundamental sense. Because it was essentially saying, hey, we don't have to take a supercomputer where we had all the calculations going inside one brain essentially of a computer. We said, hey, what if you parsed out, broke up a problem, distributed it to kind of a network of computers, and through lightning fast telecommunications, parse out the problem, pull it together, and boom, get it much faster. In fact, that's server farms. That's what you see here. And that essentially is allowed to scale. So then you just keep connecting computers and you keep getting actually more and more powerful computers. So that's when we talk about this insane computer power that you get through the cloud. That's what you're basically watching right here, only getting better too. The second thing, when you think about data, sorry, you can put that one back 1 second. When you think about data, just think of the basics on data. There's data, there's your company data. But again, just to put it in very realizable form that you can all relate to. think of video. Video is essentially, YouTube is essentially, and all video is a function of the cloud. And that's because the density of video information is so dense that you couldn't put them on the phones, you couldn't put them on servers that were just individual servers. You had to basically stitch them together in these great clouds. And so what happened is you had this thing where YouTube goes from not existing in 2005 to leveraging the cloud. They're sending off 4 billion videos a day. 4 billion videos a day. There's only 7 billion people on the planet right now, just to give you a sense. And if you flip it around to uploading, what are they uploading to? They're uploading to the cloud, right? And right now we are uploading 48 hours of video every single minute here. And to put that in context, in a month, we put more video in the cloud than essentially all television stations in the entire world combined for 60 years. That's data. That's storage. And that's just one glimpse of the level of data we're going to be putting into this insane cloud up there. That's, again, only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger at a very breakneck pace. Now, you guys are kind of geeky on this, so this is an interesting one. This is traffic on the backbone of the internet. From the earliest days when the web didn't exist here in 1990, in the early wired days, by the middle 2000 there, half of all internet traffic was web-based. Look what happens in 2005, that blue. That's video. Already by 2010, half of all traffic on the internet is video. And Cisco basically projects that by 2015, halfway through this decade here, 3 years ahead, we're going to have 90% of all traffic on the internet is going to be video. And what does that mean? That means sucking down from the cloud video. That's essentially the very practical way of saying the kind of leading edge of what the cloud really means. Now, what's really starting to open up, and this starts to affect your kind of space, is we're starting to get the two-way video going. By already 2010s, there was 500 million people using one-to-one Skype. And now what we've watched is all the biggies in Silicon Valley are essentially doubling down on group video. Apple's FaceTime up to 4, Skype now gets up to 10, Microsoft buys them for $8 billion last year, and Google now has come up with this Hangouts up to 10. And of course, you got WebEx and GoToMeeting and all this is happening. This is a very big development here. This is a very big development, and I'm going to talk about why that is. So why does this stuff matter? Why does video, and ultimately the cloud, really matter in how we do work? And let's just talk about here. I'll give you 1 second here. Let's shift. Let's type this out. This is the internet up until now. This is essentially text. You can't see the complexity of, you can't see if I'm really smiling. You can't see if I'm sweating a little bit. You can't see if I'm nervous. You can't see if I'm hiding something. You can with my face. We spent 1 million years figuring out how to communicate complexity over face-to-face communication, and up until now, the internet hasn't been able to really handle it. Until now. And so this is really a big shift. There's tons, because it opens up tons of things of human interaction to video that you could never have done. Now, could you have explained through email how to basically do that breakdance, or how do you get transition from that move to that move to that move? No, you do it through video. That's why you have an explosion of how-to videos, right? It's like opening up huge chunks of what we actually do as human beings. And the one that's really starting to affect is work. Because what's happened in the last, alongside all this development of the backbone of the internet, every device now is getting these baked-in embedded cameras. So everything now has the embedded cameras. We have the broadband now, as I've mentioned, that's starting to open up these channels of video. And so you start to do serious kind of collaboration. And in this, I would actually point out the developments at Google Plus here, where yes, they're competing with Facebook as a social media group. But really what Google is looking at is they're making a bigger play here. They're saying, how do we actually we're going to marry that to the ability to get 10 people face-to-face, marry that to the ability to start to work in the cloud through documents seamlessly, and that's where you start to get more effective collaboration. That essentially is replicating what you got here in a cabinet meeting. All serious work gets done, face-to-face meetings, working on collaborative documents, looking people in the eye, negotiating, arguing, calming people down. That's what happens. It doesn't happen through flame wars over text. It happens in the face-to-face realm. This is now virtualizing. This is now going to the cloud. And this is how all the work that you do somehow can connect to that level of sophistication. Now, just to give you one little touch of how this could go, how they can scale this up, I'm just going to show you something. If you haven't seen this, this is a guy who basically was a composer, got auditions through the internet, through video, and was able to stitch together a very collaborative piece amongst many different people. It's an insight into how we're starting to move, what you can do when you can really start to use sophisticated collaboration using video. A sign of things to come with the cloud. Now, we're going to shift here quickly to notch it up even one more notch of like, what are these powerful tools going to be used for? Well, I would argue essentially we're going through literally one of these world historical moments. We're watching the digitization of everything. Everything's getting digitized, connected to computers and interconnected. That's a world historical phenomenon. We're going global in a way that we've never done before. Again, a world historical phenomenon. These are things that in 50, 100, 500 years from now, people look back and say, aha, that's when the world went digital. That step change. That's when the world went global. We're facing climate change and other kind of crazy amounts of these problems. In fact, if you look at all our systems, essentially all our 20th century systems are breaking down. Healthcare, education, retirement systems, all kinds of stuff. And so what's really interesting about this is the country essentially has faced these other junctures before, where you get such deep structural changes to the fabric of how the economy or society works, or such unprecedented challenges that you've never seen it before. And we've watched how, in fact, America has reinvented itself essentially around these challenges 4 times. We don't have the time to go into it. There was one with Thomas Jefferson in the early part of the 19th century. There was a big one coming off the Civil War, where we reinvented how to work for the next 50 years. There's a big one at the early 20th century, the Progressive Era. And the last one we saw was essentially with the World War II, coming off of World War II and the Great Depression. And just to remind ourselves of what that one was, those folks were up against their own set of challenges. Were equally as daunting as ours. You know, they had basically their Great Depression. They had the prospect of defeating fascism, communism, nuclear war. Their nuclear war was their climate change. They had no idea how to figure it out. But they could only do 2 things: draw for their technologies and their human resources, which in fact they did. This is some of their crew there that they did it. And in the space of 15 years, they completely reinvented a new way of running the economy through Keynesian economics. They did a completely new way of essentially containing nuclear war and containing communism in this process there. In 3 years, they built whole new institutions, the UN, IMF, World Bank, institutions, frankly, we're still hanging on to going through today. And essentially, they had this whole set of domestic programs, GI Bill, Social Security, FDIC mortgages, all the stuff that we're still hanging on to here, essentially to rebuild what was going on in the United States. That all happened in 15 years. They went from not having a clue to solving it all in the space of that period. That's essentially, we look back now and we say, oh my God, these people were amazing. They weren't amazing. They were just like us. And so if you come into the next 10 to 20 years here, I think we're going to be going through one of these reinventions in this country. And I think we're actually to see a lot of the signs of it here. And we're going to be leveraging a level of powerful tools. Now here's our cloud at work here. I mean, think about how they would have thought about this. Think about how they wouldn't have to be confining their problem solving to these physical meetings looking at people in the eye, but eventually could connect up people all over the country, all over the world. Think if, in fact, instead of having a little working group trying to solve one problem, you could take on, because of that scale, all kinds of different challenges at the same time, and even go deeper into each of those challenges. Because of the scale of numbers, you could pull people together. You could do all kinds of sub kind of problem solving at a much more defined level. And so we basically are getting a situation, and you get this incredible power that you can drive all these entrepreneurs. Now, he mentioned kind of my background here. I actually have just started a new company. It's called Reinventors. It's kind of playing off in the same space. We are one of these cloud companies. I got a small little team in San Francisco. All our stuff is in the cloud. We're using the powerful computers in the cloud. We're using all our data. In fact, what we're really using is we're taking advantage of this group video. And we're stitching together people, experts, innovators from all over the country, in fact, all over the world, getting them in these roundtable things. This is free. We're using essentially initially Google Hangouts to start off this thing. This is astounding power, unleashing all this creativity for entrepreneurs like myself. But what we're actually doing, in fact, these are some of the 8 folks that are going to start off the show. It starts in the beginning of the year here, actually over the web. What they're really doing is getting into this fundamental reinvention. And here's what I'm saying. Once you connect up everything through computers, once you have the same amounts of data, you start to really, by necessity, have to reinvent how these things work. I mean, we now know, in like government regulation, Tim O'Reilly, how would you actually regulate things? Not a bureaucratic old way we did in the 20th century. How could you do it with the way we could have interconnected computers? What would you do with copyright law? How do you reinvent copyright law in a situation now where I was pulling stuff right off the web, right, going into this talk right here? The old copyright law has no idea of that kind of world. And then even privacy here. Thinking privacy. Now, we talked about security. We have to fundamentally rethink in a world where everybody's genome here is going to be essentially calculable in 10 years. It's going to essentially be in the cloud. And you can actually protect that and be hyper kind of worried about people seeing that, except you and your doctor. Or, and this is the 21st century version of privacy, you could say, wow, I could learn a lot by comparing my genome to everyone else's genome, and people with my kind of disposition and my genetic kind of layout might actually be able to learn from each other, figure out better ways to maintain our health differently. There's big shifts starting to happen now around what happens in this new world of these big data sets, these interconnected computers, this kind of decentralized network model across all kinds of different fields. The computer industry and your industries that were tied into them very quickly, you essentially are blazing a trail that is now going to move to all the different areas of America, education, energy, you name it. That's the reinvention ahead of us now. So basically, to kind of finish up here, whether you like it or not, we are essentially, I think, entering this period of essentially what is going to be seen as a real historical transformation. I would argue, without going into the kind of partisan side of what happened in this election, but I think this bodes well for the country, what we just saw in this election. And I think one of the things that we saw, which is a longer story, was essentially big data and the cloud applied to politics. Obama totally finessed it the first cycle, 2004 to 2008. I was involved in that product of how do you essentially rework politics to the internet. This one was about how do you do the cloud and big data for politics, and he blew away the competition. And now I think he's going to apply this with his teams much more thoroughly into governing. How do you start to use the computer models, essentially, that are cutting edge and apply it to government? I know for a fact in most of the departments he's got really techie crews, kind of well-poised in most departments, and he himself and the people who got him elected really know technology. So I would say hang on for what you're going to do with it. Now the thing is, it's not going to be about Obama, it's going to be about all of us. And I would say what we're heading into is an era where we can draw off of two things, the same thing that previous era had, our human resources and our technology. Well, in human resource terms, you go back to World War II, the beginning of this chart here, less than 5% in America had a college education. Now it's about 30%. In real numbers, essentially, those are the comparisons of how many college-educated folks we have. We have about 15 times as many. Not the only people to reinvent stuff, but basically it's not a bad team you'd rather have tying up together to reinvent your country. But the real thing is, could you imagine if gone into like FDR and his crew and said, hey, I got this thing where you can ask any question in the world and get all the world's information back in a second? You know, he would have thought, this is magic, this is ludicrous. And of course, it's Google, and every one of your kids, 5-year-old kids, knows how to do it. I mean, we have an extraordinary set of technologies here. And so our era, we are every bit capable of making this transition to this really all-digital society, making that step change. We are completely capable of making this transition to this all-global world that we're heading into. We are completely capable of making this sustainable society to solving this climate change ultimately. And I think we're going to see basically a fundamental reinvention on the scale that we've seen it in these other periods in history. And I think in 50, 100, 500 years' time, people look back in the early 21st century, they'll say, wow, that's when the world went digital. That's when the world went global. That's when the world went sustainable. That's when America reinvented itself one more time and basically helped lead the world into that 21st century world, that era. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. Been a good audience. Good luck on the rest of the conference. And if you want to get a hold of me, we launched this new company here. We got a new website up, and we're going to have the show start the first of the year. Thank you.